Hello, I'm Kyle Johnson, and this is What Are You Reading? A podcast devoted to books and the perspectives of their readers. When today's book was first released in 1980, one critic remarked that if the writer never published another word, he would have made his mark. It tells the story of a young apprentice in a torturer's guild, beginning with his youth and culminating in his expulsion from the guild and hometown. The novel, which became part of a series, cemented the author's prominence in the genre, and he became known as the Melville of science fiction. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and thanks for listening.
So I am Daniel Backer. I'm the author of Lionel Lancet and The Right Vibe. I have a YouTube channel about books called Off the Wall Novels, and I've been posting on TikTok a lot recently, which is where I met Kyle, actually. And he gave me some fantastic notes on my book, so I appreciate that, and I'm happy to be here.
Oh, well, thank you. Happy to have you. So what are you reading?
So I am currently reading and really enjoying The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe.
So tell me what I need to know about The Shadow of the Torturer.
So, big picture is that it's literary sci-fi fantasy, and there's an unreliable first-person narrator that I think really makes it kind of mysterious, the different aspects of this world, because instead of just like info dumping and long extended paragraphs about the rules or magic systems and things like that, they just drop these little glancing moments of things outside of the ordinary that are ordinary to this world and ordinary to this torturer named Severian's life. And that's the thing that I found the most compelling so far, is that it kind of keeps you guessing as to what the rules of this world even are.
And just for those who may not read this type of book that often, like me, is that an aspect of fantasy novels that's common? This world building and magical systems, that kind of thing?
So I don't read a ton of fantasy, but the impression that I get from different writing forums that I'm active in, specifically on Reddit, people usually are there for the magic system, or they want to see some kind of rigor there or some creative choices being made. So I would say it's like a pretty dominant convention of the genre, even though I don't read a ton of it.
Uh-huh. And can you describe the world of Shadow of the Torturer?
So I'm about halfway through. So to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure that I can completely, because it's being revealed in these very glancing ways. And so to be honest, sometimes I even have a hard time picturing the sort of era or time period that it's supposed to be set in. But there are like flying beasts. There seems to be people who can use light magic in order to achieve their ends. There are these different guilds that stratify society under the autarch or autarch. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but this like kind of totalitarian ruler is controlling this world. And it appears also that there are other planets that humans have colonized, and Earth, spelled URTH, is the one that Severian, our narrator, inhabits. I think really one of the strengths is that it builds the world so indirectly that your imagination can really take over. And it seems like more than the sum of its parts.
So, I mean, out of all the sci-fi or fantasy reads, why should people read this one?
So I think it's because it's got a really good blend of a literary fiction vibe and a genre vibe. And as I was reading it and knowing I was going to do this podcast, I've been trying to define for myself, like, what is a literary feel in a book? And the short answer is it's something you just kind of know it when you see it. But I think the longer answer has something to do with, like, it's got a deeper investigation of the psychology of the character. And it's just playing with something maybe a little bit beyond a standard plot that's leading toward a traditional destination or character goal.
So if those are the literary elements, are there any more genre elements that are specific to this sci-fi fantasy book?
Yeah, I think beyond what I've listed about the different sci-fi and fantasy stuff, the genre stuff seems to be just these like really delightful ways that the author is playing with perception versus reality, which is something that I've always really enjoyed in fiction that I like, where the narrator isn't just unreliable because he doesn't have access to everything. It kind of gets into the character's dreams and does these really trippy sequences where it's like he encounters these beings in his dreams, and at least I assume we're going to encounter those in the story or maybe in the other installments in this series at some point, where he comes across these like giant magical women that have like coral eyes and sea green hair that like pick him up and show him the world. Another dream of his is he's like flying on the back of this ibis-faced beast that seems to be able to communicate the thoughts to him telepathically. So those are just a few examples, but that stuff just always excites me so much. So I would say those are the most fun genre parts.
Can you talk a bit about any difficulties involved in reading or understanding The Shadow of the Torturer?
Sure, yeah. So I think that since it doesn't have as much of a clear plot, at least from the beginning, it's a bit of a slow build because it's only like a 210-page book in my edition, and the character doesn't really start on his call to action or the journey until about halfway through the book. And so if you do like more of a straightforward plot where you kind of know where it's going, the first couple chapters might leave you a little bit like grasping for, okay, cool, he went to this place that's really interesting and talked to this person, but I don't really see what this is leading toward.
You mentioned that you don't read this type of book very often, so I'm wondering how you came across it and how you decided to read it.
So I probably once or twice a year get really frustrated with the types of books that I read. And so I will just scour the internet and different social media platforms for something that's like pretty different, but kind of stretches me too. In the past, what I've done is I mostly read postmodern fiction. That's like my favorite stuff, like Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace. And then when I wanted to break from that, I like some kind of older genre novels like Raymond Chandler or King Solomon's Mines really got me out of a reading slump. And so then this year, I was just like, I just want to completely change it up and check out some fantasy because I loved reading that growing up. And then after getting into lit fiction and postmodern fiction in college, I kind of stopped because I love literary fiction. But then sometimes I'm just like, okay, what's the point? Where is this going? And so something that does have a little bit more genre to it, I think can be refreshing.
Uh-huh. You're a writer too, so what elements of this book do you think you'll pull out and use in your own arsenal? Or I guess, how do you get inspiration or influence from the things that you read?
I mostly get influence, I think, in terms of pacing. I really like to see how an author can balance their prose versus the scenes that they use. And so I think one of the most excellent things on a craft level in The Shadow of the Torturer is that we get just enough internal rumination from the narrator balanced with scenes to keep things interesting. And the chapters are pretty squarely arranged. This might seem kind of dry to some people, but I'm always impressed when there's like a standardized chapter length, and he'll vary it by like a half a page or so, or maybe even a full page. But that sort of pacing I find really attractive, that you can kind of reliably expect to see how the story is going to be dished out. And then beyond that, I think it's a completely masterful use of first person POV, which is notoriously hard to do, in my opinion, because it's difficult to evoke things like dramatic irony, situations that the first person narrator is unaware of, but you still want to get across to the reader. And so I just think it's extremely well done in this book that the main character is delivering his account of the story, but there's enough that seems to happen like outside of his perspective that he's somehow able to communicate through his perspective. And that's been really inspiring.
With these first person unreliable narrators, a lot of times I feel like the story is special because of that aspect of the limited perspective. I think you said that that's one of the more interesting aspects of this story, the unreliability. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. Yeah, I think the unreliability, and then also just how much attention he pays to things that, okay, so for example, since he's a torturer, he's extremely violent to people, but that's given almost no attention because that's just his day to day. He has to torture people, but that's what makes it so cool, is because he'll just casually mention that there's like a younger boy who's an apprentice that he like beats his head against the wall at one point, and he's like a friend of the narrator, but the narrator takes his head and beats it against the wall in order to get him to do something. And this is just shrugged off. But I think that's such a dynamic move in the story because it just completely builds the world of this character without overdoing it.
So with that anecdote that you just gave, can I ask you, how do you read violence in literature?
Sure.
I know that's a broad question, but I guess when I approach it, I feel like it kind of propels my reading forward. I get a bit of a rush. Do you ever experience that?
I think maybe in a different way. There's definitely a visceral rush that comes across, but then I think that just since I'm not seeing it as compared to like watching violence in a movie, I don't know if it completely I don't know if it makes me read faster necessarily, but it is interesting. And then from a writing perspective too, I'm probably more critical of violence in a story because it seems like sometimes people can use it to be sensational and as a placeholder for something that might be more interestingly developed without it. But I think, yeah, when it works, it's a delicate thing to pull off.
You mentioned film. I guess it would really just depend on the filmmaker, right? Violence is depicted and dealt with differently in something like a Quentin Tarantino film versus David Lynch or Catherine Bigelow or something. So it really just depends on the personality of the creator. So maybe talking about it as a broad theme might be a little bit unproductive.
That is true. Because I think when it's in a film, to be perfectly honest, a lot of times I'm like, oh, that's awesome. You know, like there's no empathy involved as cold as this makes me sound. It's just kind of like, ooh, yeah, this is like an interesting visual image that I'm being presented with that I think I can kind of distance myself from it, knowing that it is actors playing it and it's all safe for all intents and purposes.
Uh-huh. So going back to approaching it in literature or in Shadow of the Torturer, does it hurt a bit more when you read it? I mean, is it the same kind of entertainment or detachment as it would be in film for you?
I think it's a different kind of detachment since I'm not seeing it. I'm encountering it more as information. And so that being said, just to bring it back to Shadow of the Torturer, I don't want to give this away because it's a pretty dominant plot point in the book, but the cold detachment that the narrator feels toward violence, I think does give me a visceral reaction because I'm not just getting a scene of like a fight or something like that. I'm getting this narrator that through the framing, I'm kind of being asked to empathize with, and he's being very, very violent, very casually. I think it kind of makes me, beyond like a visceral physical reaction, it's more of like, now I have to question like, oh yeah, I'm sympathizing with this character who uses violence very flippantly.
Right. Kind of wrapping up, what is a final thought you'd like people to hear about Shadow of the Torturer or Gene Wolfe or maybe reading in general?
I think overall, I'm just really struck by these very psychedelic feeling scenes and yeah, just the interesting imagery that he's coming up with. Because I think when people hear genre terms like fantasy and sci-fi, it conjures spaceships and castles. And this seems to be a lot more psychological than I expected. So that would be, I would say, the main selling point. I think I'm always after stuff that blends literary fiction and genre. And so if that appeals to you in any way, I think you'd enjoy this book.
Today's guest was Daniel Backer, who's reading The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. More information about Daniel and his work can be found in the show notes of this episode. The music heard now and at the start of the episode is from the album Wallflower by percussionist Julian Loida. If you liked this discussion, please consider leaving the What Are You Reading podcast a good rating and review, or feel free to contact me using the email address in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening.